Welcome to the Pencil Bob channel. I hope you enjoy my stories. Please like and subscribe, and hit that notification icon so you never miss out. Now on with the stories.
The day I decided to add a deck to our small backyard is etched in my mind. I wanted something modest but nice, a little place to sit outside with a cup of coffee or a glass of wine, a place for friends or family to sit when they came over. After a lot of looking around, I found a landscaper who came highly recommended, and I showed him the exact dimensions allowed by the HOA. He assured me he'd stick to the guidelines, and we filled out the necessary paperwork and submitted everything to the HOA for approval. 60 days went by without a single word from them. In my head, I thought, great, that probably means I'm good to go. But to be absolutely sure, I figured I'd double-check the HOA's bylaws. You'd think they'd make something like that easy to find, but of course not. The bylaws were nowhere to be found on the HOA's website, so I went to the next logical place, the HOA Facebook group. My post was simple, just asking if anyone had a copy of the bylaws. But it turned out I wasn't the only one who couldn't find them. People started commenting things like, "I've been looking for those for ages," and "Good luck getting the HOA to respond." It was almost funny how many people had never seen the rules they were supposedly living under. Within 24 hours of that post, I got an email from the HOA with the subject line in all caps, "Request denied." No greeting, no explanation, just "deck too big for our small backyards." That was it. I stared at that email, feeling a mix of frustration and disbelief. My landscaper had followed every single rule to the letter. There was no way the deck was too big. I forwarded the email to him, and he replied with the city's regulations and a copy of the HOA's guidelines, highlighting every section proving my deck was well within the specified limits. He even went above and beyond, adding measurements and a little breakdown in case anyone on the board couldn't do basic math. So, armed with all the facts, I filed an appeal. It felt ridiculous to have to appeal something so clear-cut, but I thought maybe this would bring them to their senses. Another 30 days passed. Not a word from them. Not a, "We received your appeal." Not a, "We'll get back to you." Nothing. Every day I'd check my inbox, hoping for some sign of movement, but each day it was just radio silence. Finally, 2 weeks after I'd initially asked for the bylaws, an email came in with an attachment labeled HOA bylaws. As I opened it, I felt a sliver of hope. I thought maybe, just maybe, I'd find something in there that would explain why they were acting like this. But what I found only made things worse. According to the bylaws, the HOA could ignore requests, which meant that if they didn't respond within 60 days, my request was considered automatically denied. I read it over and over, thinking there had to be some mistake. So they can just sit on their hands and do nothing. And that's their way of saying no? I thought out loud. It was there in black and white. If the architectural reviewer fails to respond in writing, negatively, affirmatively, or requesting information within 60 days after the reviewer's actual receipt of the application is deemed denied. The more I read, the angrier I got. This wasn't some minor oversight or innocent delay. This was a system set up so they didn't have to do anything, and they'd still get their way. My blood was boiling. I shot off an email to the HOA, attaching the city's guidelines, our own HOA's rules, and every single document my landscaper had provided. My message was direct. Please explain how this deck is too big when every measurement falls within the specified guidelines. Several days later, I received a response from Linda, the board president. She wrote, "The bylaws are the bylaws. We cannot make exceptions based on your interpretations. If the reviewer has decided your deck is not suitable, that's the final decision." My interpretations. I had the city's guidelines and the HOA's own rules backing me up. I replied, "Linda, there's no interpretation involved here. I'm simply following the rules as they are stated. I would appreciate it if you could look over the documents I've provided before dismissing this request." She responded a day later, "Your interpretation does not align with the HOA's decision. We have a duty to maintain the aesthetic of the neighborhood, and oversized decks are not permitted." Oversized. I couldn't believe what I was reading. I'd measured and remeasured, double-checked every detail. I was so furious I could barely think straight. I called up my landscaper and told him everything. He was just as baffled and irritated as I was. "Look, they can't just change the rules on you like that," he said. "You have every right to push back." So, I decided to take it a step further. I requested a meeting with the board. I wanted to look each of them in the eye and make them explain, face to face, why they were pulling this nonsense. Of course, they made me wait another couple of weeks before they found time to schedule the meeting. When the day finally came, I arrived armed with every document, every photo, every piece of evidence I had. Linda sat at the head of the table, flanked by two other board members who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. I took a deep breath and began my presentation, laying out every detail of the guidelines, the measurements, the deck plan, and the city regulations. Linda cut me off halfway through. "This isn't about city regulations," she snapped. "We're not bound by what the city says. Our standards are different." "Different how?" I shot back. "The HOA guidelines clearly state the allowed dimensions, and my deck is within those dimensions." One of the other board members, a guy named Rick, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Well, I mean, it's not that big of a deal," he muttered, glancing at Linda. Linda shot him a glare that could have melted steel. "It is a big deal," she said icily. "If we allow one oversized deck, next thing we know, every backyard will be filled with monstrosities." I held back a laugh. "Monstrosities? I'm adding a deck that's exactly within your rules. I'm not building a skyscraper." She leaned forward, her face inches from mine. "We are not approving this deck. End of discussion." I stared at her, speechless. "So, what's the point of having guidelines if they're just suggestions?" Linda smirked. "They're not suggestions. They're rules we enforce when we see fit." I looked at the other board members, hoping one of them would step in, but they both just looked down, avoiding my gaze. "Fine," I said, gathering up my papers. "But you're going to hear from my lawyer." Linda's smirk disappeared. "You think a lawyer is going to intimidate us? We deal with this all the time." "Well, then maybe it's time someone actually held you accountable," I shot back. I left that meeting fuming, knowing I was up for a fight but determined not to back down. After talking to a lawyer, I filed a formal complaint and notified the HOA that I was pursuing legal action. The next few weeks were tense. Every time I passed by Linda or any of the board members, I'd get icy glares or little smirks like they thought this was all some big joke. But I was dead serious. My lawyer helped me draft letters, and we prepared for what looked like it was going to be a battle. And sure enough, once they realized I wasn't bluffing, things changed. A month later, I received a carefully worded email from the HOA, suddenly willing to reevaluate my application. They invited me to another meeting to discuss potential compromises. Linda's name was conspicuously absent from the invite list. At that meeting, I presented my case again, this time to a new set of faces, people who seemed much more willing to listen. After some back and forth, they finally agreed that my deck fell within the guidelines and gave me the go-ahead. The new board even apologized for the misunderstanding. But it wasn't just about the deck anymore. The whole process had exposed a bigger problem: how easily people like Linda could exploit the rules to suit their own preferences. And while I'd won this battle, I knew others would face the same uphill struggle unless things changed. When the deck was finally built, I made sure to throw a small gathering to celebrate. As I sat there with friends, enjoying the new space, I couldn't help but feel a mixture of relief and triumph. This deck had been a simple addition, but in the end, it became a symbol of standing up to a system that often bullies people into silence. And every time I stepped out onto that deck, I was reminded of the fight it took to make it happen. Thanks for this. They are indeed breaking the law. I've inquired several times about when the committee is meeting to review my appeal and was told they didn't know and to be patient. The board shall hold a hearing under this section not later than the 30th day after the date the board receives the owner's request for a hearing and shall notify the owner of the date, time, and place of the hearing not later than the 10th day before the date of the hearing. Only one hearing is required under this subsection. The law always supersedes things like HOAs. What are you smoking? The HOA can be more or less restrict than the law's required minimums and maximums, but they can't break the law. If the law states a lack of response in 30 days is an auto-approval, that's the law. The HOA screwed up and loses. That's it. The CCR text doesn't matter at that point. My HOA rules includes this same, "we can ignore you" rule. And I've always wondered if it was legal. Being over 30 days isn't a particularly long time, though, if it works anything like mine in Florida. It's a separate board of volunteers who meet to approve these, so if they meet once a month, waiting that long would be fairly normal. You should, though, have the right to ask the management for updates as well as to know when the board meets, so you can join the meeting and ask for clarifications. They're also required to provide you the specific rule you'd violate. Attending the meeting may cut down on miscommunications and make it faster. Though it sounds a bit sus that they may not be strictly following the rules in a few different ways. A separate thing to preemptively check before you do anything expensive though. Even if they explicitly limit decks and you're within those rules, there could be a separate limit to the amount of the total lot that must remain unbuilt, which could be for nonsense density aesthetic reasons or for water runoff reasons. E.g., if you have a 45 by 100 lot for 4,500, you may have a 35 by 50 house for 1,750 square feet and 600 square feet of driveway and 100 square feet of sidewalk. If you're only allowed to hardscape 60% of the lot, you only have 250 square feet left.
I would like to thank you for watching the video to the end. To encourage us to make more videos, please like, subscribe, comment, as well as share. Check out this other video if you haven't already.